All right, welcome back. In this video, we are continuing with sort of the English 101 crash course type stuff. In this video, I'm going to talk about independent clauses and dependent clauses, how we can combine them to make 4 different kinds of sentences, and then that will transition into the main objective of this video, which is talking about comma splices, run-ons, and sentence fragments, the 3 most common mistakes that students make in their writing. Easy to find, easy to fix, easy to make. So let's go ahead and get into it by talking about clauses and not Santa Claus, right? I'm going to pull up the whiteboard. These notes will be made available should you need them. There are largely, well, really, there are 2 different kinds of clauses that we can have in a sentence. The first is, spell it correctly, an independent clause. An independent clause expresses a complete thought and is able to stand on its own. Now, this is, in comparison with a dependent clause, which, as its name implies, depends on something else. So a dependent clause not express a complete thought and is unable to stand on its own. Now, different websites and different books, they'll often say independent clause has a subject and a verb, and a dependent clause can have a subject and a verb. Yes, both statements can be true, but it's a bit of an obtuse definition, which is why I prefer to go with they express complete thoughts, they can stand on their own. This is a little bit more usable, a little bit more actionable, especially when we look at the examples that we're going to look at later in this video. So sentences are often combinations of independent clauses, dependent clauses. We also have different kinds of phrases that we could throw in, participial phrases, prepositional phrases, things like that. I'm not going to get into phrases so much in this video, just going to try and keep it as relatively simple as possible. So we have independent clauses, we have dependent clauses. Let's talk about how to combine these and make sentences with them, shall we? The first kind of sentence we can make is a simple sentence. A simple sentence is just an independent clause. So as an example, we might write, Yesenia works at a pizza place. All right. So this expresses a complete thought. We have our subject, Yesenia. We have our verb, works, and then we have at a pizza place. Yesenia was one of my students from this past semester. And she did, in fact, work at a pizza place. The next kind of sentence we can make is what is called a compound sentence. This is when we have an independent clause plus a coordinating conjunction and another independent clause. So, for example, we might write, we'll keep the first independent clause. Senya works at a pizza place, comma, so she always smells like pizza. When we talk about coordinating conjunctions, there are 7 of them. Cue up your Schoolhouse Rock conjunction junction video for your throwback reference. This is sometimes referred to as the fanboys because that's the easiest mnemonic device to remember them. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. We use a coordinating conjunction with a comma to make a compound sentence to connect 2 independent clauses. Yesenia works at a pizza place. She always smells like pizza. And then there's our coordinating conjunction. Now, a complex sentence, nothing too complex. This is when we have an independent clause plus a dependent clause. So, for example, even though she dislikes pizza, comma, Yesenia works at a pizza place. Okay. So the dependent clause, and this is going to be relevant for when we talk about sentence fragments here in a moment. Remember, it depends on the rest of the sentence. So if we read the dependent clause just by itself, it shouldn't make sense. For example, even though she dislikes pizza, you're like, yeah, keep going. Depends on the rest of the sentence. You're waiting for the rest of the sentence. Even though she dislikes pizza, comma, Yesenia works at a pizza place. So the final kind of sentence largely that we can make is a compound complex sentence. We have our independent clause, we have a dependent clause, we have a coordinating conjunction, and we have another independent clause. By the way, doesn't necessarily have to go in this order, right? So in the complex sentence example, you could see I have the dependent clause first, and then the independent clause. So these, think of them like modules. Many of them you can move around, swap them out. But for the compound sentence, that it's always independent clause, coordinating conjunction, independent clause. So let's put the whole thing together, right? Even though she dislikes pizza, comma, Yesenia works at a pizza place, so she always smells like pizza. And I'll put periods on the end of all these sentences lest I get called out for that. Okay, so there we go. Let me go ahead and put the coordinating conjunctions on here as well, just for kind of good measure, right? So our coordinating conjunctions, we got the fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. And there we go. Okay. The reason why I kind of front load the discussion about comma splices, run-ons, and sentence fragments with kind of this very brief crash course on sentences and clauses is because this is some of the language that we're going to use to talk about comma splices, run-ons, and sentence fragments. All right. So with that, let's go ahead. Let's do sentence fragments first, because in my opinion, sentence fragments are one of the easier grammar errors to spot, diagnose, and fix. So a sentence fragment, as its name implies, is a fragment of a sentence. It is a sentence that is incomplete and cannot stand on its own. Many of the errors we make in writing tends to be a result of just transcribing what we hear in our heads. Writing and speech are two totally different things, even though we often kind of conflate the two. So many of the mistakes that we make tend to be a result of just, kind of transcribing the thoughts in our head, all right? And sentence fragments are absolutely an example of this, okay? Because when we talk, we don't necessarily think about punctuation, right? We just kind of go when we pause wherever we feel like it. However, reading your writing aloud is one of the best things you can do. We have boatloads of evidence that speaks to this, and especially with sentence fragments, because when we hear a sentence fragment, it sounds incomplete. All right. So to that end, let's actually take a look at an example. All right. Let's do this. Yeah. So this is an example from a student paper about food. They had to look at a picture of a family from, I think, Texas, and it had all their food for a week, and the family was arranged around the picture. And this is what this student wrote. So I'm going to read the entire paragraph aloud, and we will pause as we encounter sentence fragments. So here we go. The food that is around the family is a lot, but good and healthy. many options of meals to cook and to snack on. We have our first sentence fragment. Now, we can get into the grammar of this if we want. There are no verbs in this sentence. We have some verb phrases in their infinitive forms, so to cook, to snack, or to snack on with our phrasal verb there, right? But it is not a complete sentence. Many options of meals to cook and to snack on. Let's keep going. In the background, there is a pantry with more food inside. Also, they have a refrigerator with foods that last longer, like frozen meat. Instead of buying fast food, they are feeding their children and themselves nice, good meals, like chicken and meat that have protein and plates of pasta, salads, and mac and cheese. Now here we have another sentence fragment. Like chicken and meat that have protein and plates of pasta, salads, and mac and cheese. When you hear it just by itself, you're kind of like, wait, what? So again, when you hear it, you can detect that it's a fragment. I'm just going to go ahead and highlight this, as well as the other sentence fragment, so we come back to it. Since two incoming sources are happening, we're going to ignore the spelling issues and other errors in this paragraph. Since two incoming sources are happening, comma, the setting of the environment is the family lives in a nice home in a good neighborhood. As well, maybe with a good school system and a nice local grocery store. Again, we have a sentence fragment here. If we just read it by itself, as well, maybe with a good school system and a nice local grocery store. Sounds incomplete. There is no verb in the sentence. Let's look at the next one. Looking at how nice and big the kitchen seems, we have another sentence fragment. And then with their pantry in the background, holding more food. So we have two sentence fragments, well, technically three sentence fragments in a row. So we have found our sentence fragments. We proofread our paragraph. So let's talk about fixing sentence fragments. There are two ways that we can fix sentence fragments. The first is that we can connect the sentence fragment with either the sentence before or the sentence after it. Because in my experience, usually I notice students making sentence fragments when they're adding more detail to a sentence either before or after. So usually if you connect it, it'll work. The alternative is you make it into a complete sentence, all right? So looking at this, let's see what we can do. The food that is around the family is a lot, but good and healthy. So in this case, I'm actually going to do something a little bit more advanced. I am going to connect this, but I'm going to turn it into a dependent clause. Right? This is specifically kind of subordinating clause. And now I'm going to mark this green. I'm actually going to also lowercase that m. So now the sentence reads, the food that is around the family is a lot, but good and healthy with many options of meals to cook and to snack on. All right, let's keep going. Here is our next sentence fragment. Instead of buying fast food, I'm just going to go ahead and add that comma because that's going to bug me. They are feeding their children and themselves nice, good meals, and we're just going to go ahead and combine this. Like chicken and meat that have protein and plates of pasta, salads, and mac and cheese. I don't necessarily know if mac and cheese constitutes a good meal. I mean, it's good in the taste sense, but if it's good in the nutrition sense, let me know. Now, this last one's going to require a little bit more work, okay? Since two, and I'm just going to go ahead and correct, since two income sources are happening, the setting of the environment is the family lives in a nice home in a good neighborhood. And so here, as well, maybe with a good school system and a nice local grocery store, I'm going to go ahead and delete the as well. And then looking at how nice and big the kitchen seems with their pantry in the background holding more food. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this one as done. With these final two, I think I might just rewrite them, but still kind of holding on to the core, the essence of it. So looking at how nice and big the kitchen seems, that's a good participial phrase, so I'd like to keep that. So I'm going to delete the with. Their pantry in the background holds more food. And there we go. So now we have a grammatically correct sentence. Looking at how nice and big the kitchen seems, their pantry in the background holds more food. Note about sentence fragments. Sentence fragments, as I'm reading more and more student papers, I'm not seeing them as often as I used to. Some cautionary words, though, and maybe I'll put this back on the whiteboard. There are certain, I won't call them like popular, but certain common kinds of sentence fragments. So for instance, which is what we call a relative pronoun, which begins a relative clause, which is a kind of dependent clause. Which can never begin a sentence, unless if it's a question. All right, if you have like, which route are we taking? That's fine, right? That's a question. But often, one of the more common kinds of sentence fragments I see is students beginning just a regular declarative sentence with which, and that is a sentence fragment. So with which, you can almost always hook it up with the previous sentence. I'm also noticing, especially as a common sentence, first word of a sentence, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's usually used either as a transition word, which is fine. But when I see it starting a dependent clause, you just want to make sure that you have an independent clause not far after it, kind of hooking up with it. Okay. So which, and then you also want to be mindful of your INGs. Now, there are two different kinds of ING verbs. We have participles, present participles. We also have gerunds. Present participles start participial phrases. So if we look back to the example, and I mentioned it very briefly, this last sentence, looking at how nice and big the kitchen seems, that is a participial phrase. So whenever you have an ING word that's not a gerund, we want to be careful with it. We want to get into the whole thing about participles and gerunds. It's going to be, that's a video in and of itself, all right? So sentence fragments, very common, but easy to fix, relatively low stakes in the grand scheme of things. Very different from bringing the whiteboard back. Very different from run-ons, okay? Run-ons and comma splices. And let's actually start with comma splices. So a comma splice is when you have two or more independent clauses separated or spliced by a comma. Sorry, helicopter going overhead. The joys of living in LA. When you have two or more independent clauses separated or spliced by a comma, all right? So first, let's talk about why we make comma splices. Commas are easily the most misunderstood punctuation mark, even though they have pretty simple rules. However, we're often told to place a comma where we pause, but again, that is more relevant to speech, right? And again, when people talk, they may pause wherever they choose, and you could insert Christopher Walken here, pausing at odd intervals if you wish. Technically, where you pause is, at the end of a sentence, right? Punctuation, I believe, and I have a friend who's a classics professor, and he's probably going to grill me on this, but punctuation, I believe, comes from the Latin punctus, which, was basically like the stopping point, okay? So technically, where you're supposed to pause is at the end of the sentence. So to say, put a comma where you pause isn't, the best way to think of commas. Comma, what it is it's an organizing element. It helps organize elements within a sentence to make them more readable, easy to understand, eliminate confusion, stuff like that. Okay. So how do we find a comma splice? So how to find? If you're in a document, you could do Control F, or for my Mac weirdos, you could do Command F. That'll bring up the find dialog box, and then just type in a comma. All right. And what this will do is this will highlight all of the commas in your paper. Now, this could be good or bad depending on how heavily you use commas. I was working with a student one time and they had 84 commas in their paper, and I was just like, whoa, this is going to take a while. All right. But this will at least, point them out, highlight them, all that. So how to diagnose a comma splice. If both of the clauses before and after comma express complete thoughts, then there's a comma splice. If only one of the clauses before or after the comma expresses a complete thought, then it is likely not a comma splice. All right. And this actually is a very good test, right? If both of the clauses before and after the comma express complete thoughts, that doesn't express a complete thought. So we know that this is a dependent clause. It is a comma splice. That does express a complete thought. So we know that this is okay. All right. So you have to look at what comes before and what comes after the comma. All right. Does it express a complete thought? Is it able to stand on its own? Is it an independent clause? And so we found it, we diagnosed it. Now, how do we fix it? There are 3 ways that I recommend, and then there is a 4th way that I generally don't recommend. It's a little bit more advanced, but so how to fix? How to fix a comma splice? Option 1 is you can replace the comma with a period, right? You've got 2 complete sentences. That's a totally valid move. You may replace the comma with a semicolon. If you want me to do a whole video on the other punctuation marks, semicolon, colon, and dash, I'm happy to do that. But semicolon, absolutely, you can use it in place of the period, especially if the 2 sentences are very closely connected in terms of like idea and thought. You may insert a coordinating conjunction after the comma to form a compound sentence, right? We just talked about that with sentence fragments. And you may, this is the advanced one, you may change one of the independent clauses into a dependent clause. Okay. The thing you don't want to do not delete the comma. All right. Because if you just delete the comma, then you have a run-on sentence. So a run-on sentence is when you have 2 or more independent clauses in the same sentence. Okay. Now, if you're looking at that definition and thinking, well, that looks a lot like the comma splice definition. Yeah, that's kind of intentional. Many grammar books will often put comma splices and run-on sentences in the same section, labeled as fused sentences, as in you have 2 or more sentences fused together. Now, the bad news about run-on sentences is they can be a little bit harder to find. Just because you have a long sentence doesn't mean it's a run-on sentence. I have seen short sentences that are run-ons. It's not common, but I have seen them. Okay, so that's the bad news. If you want to find them, you really have to kind of get in there, look at the grammar, also look at the subjects. Okay, in my experience, often when a student has a run-on, there is a very clear shift in subject between the independent clauses. And we'll take a look at this in the example. The good news is we fix a run-on sentence same way we fix a comma splice. Insert a period, insert a semicolon, put in a coordinating conjunction with a comma, or you change one of the independent clauses into a dependent clause, right? So let me save this and let's take a look at an example from a student paper from just this past semester. So this was our example that we just looked at. Coming over to this one. Let me zoom in a little bit more. There we go. Cool. All right. So same deal. I'm going to read it aloud. We're going to focus primarily on the comma splices and the run-on sentences. There might be other grammar or style issues with this paper, but we're just going to kind of ignore those for now. Here we go. This student wrote, I've had a sweet and sour relationship with learning in general over my lifetime in the K-12 system. Which, by the way, what a fantastic descriptor. A sweet and sour relationship. Man, that's just good stuff. Anyway, nothing for me ever stood consistent. Again, it's kind of a clunky phrasing, but grammatically it's fine. I feel like it was always really rare for me to have a good moment, comma, when I felt like I was completely grasping a topic and striving to get good grades or a single grade for just even one class. So here we have a comma. What comes before it certainly is an independent clause. I feel like it was really rare for me to have a good moment. However, what comes after the comma, this is not an independent clause. This is, entirely fine just as a dependent clause. So this comma is okay. Whenever I felt like I was getting a subject and slowly picking up my grade, comma, I would always question myself. Same thing here. It's kind of almost the same situation, just in reverse, right? We have the when statement in the front, the dependent clause in the front, and then the independent clause in the back of the sentence. Okay. How long can I keep this up? Am I just getting lucky? I felt like I was an outsider in class most of the time, comma, it always felt like everyone else always understood everything the teacher would talk about, comma, whenever there was questions to be asked, comma, it wasn't the questions I had in my mind, comma, it just felt like I was just lost in the noise that the teacher would make. Oh boy, we got not just a comma splice, we have comma splices, plural. And if you saw, I had to take a breath somewhere down in this part. So let's highlight each independent clause to really kind of illustrate the sentence. So the first one is this one. I felt like I was an outsider in class most of the time. I'm going to highlight this sort of lightish yellow. It always felt like everyone else always understood everything the teacher would talk about. That's our next one. I'll highlight that as kind of like this lightish green. Now notice the subject change, right? Our verb is the same, felt, right? We have the same verb, but notice the subject change. I felt, it felt. So we have a comma splice. Now here we have another dependent clause, and this one it's kind of tricky because when we talk about fixing this comma splice, this is where if I was conferencing with this student, I would ask, okay, is this whenever going with this, that it always felt like clause, or is it going with the, it wasn't the questions I had in my mind one, right? But this is the next independent clause, so we'll highlight this. Maybe as like this dark blue color. And then it just felt like I was just lost in the noise that the teacher would make. I'll highlight that maybe at the start. So here you can see we have 4 independent clauses, roughly all the same structure. I felt, it wasn't, it felt, right? And for the sake of time, I'm just going to do some simple edits, but if I were having a longer session with this student, since we have 1, 2, 3 sentences that all kind of follow the same pattern, we might do some more heavy-handed like sentence combining here. Let's just say I felt like I was an outsider in class most of the time. Let's make that period. It always felt like everyone else always understood everything the teacher would talk about. And I'm going to make that its own sentence as well. Whenever there were questions to be asked, comma, it wasn't the questions I had in my mind. And here, I'm going to insert the semicolon. Whenever there were questions to be asked, it wasn't the questions I had in my mind. It just felt like I was just lost in the noise that the teacher would make. All right. So here I did a couple of different things. I made 2 of the sentences kind of their own. And then those last 2 I kind of combined, or connected with a semicolon. So let's keep going. For the most part, every subject for me was a logistical struggle, comma, from learning to taking notes fast enough before the teacher would move her notebook out from under the projector camera to struggling to do homework on a timely manner and not let it take me 3 hours for one assignment. This from learning to taking notes fast enough before the teacher would move her notebook out from under the projector camera to struggling like, this is okay, but I would still kind of clean this up. But we're just talking about comma splices here, so that comma is technically okay. Math for me stood out, though it would often make the smart part of my brain feel bipolar, comma, when I understood what the assignment was, comma, I was on top of the world. I would be rivaling the best kids in the class, but a lot of the time I would also be in the lowest grade percentile. So we have both comma splices and a run-on all in the same sentence. So let's do the same thing. Let's highlight our independent clauses just so we can kind of get a lay of the land here. So our first subject is math. Math stood out, though it would often make the smart part of my brain feel bipolar. That's an interesting descriptor. Student wrote this. I did not write this. When I understood what the assignment was, comma, I was on top of the world, I would be rivaling. So here's our next independent clause. Then I would be rivaling the best kids in the class. This one, that's a little too similar. Do that red color. But a lot of the time, I would also be in the lowest grade percentile. So I'm not highlighting the coordinating conjunction because we're going to do something with that. Make that peachy color. So we have both comma splices and run-ons, all right? So let's go through it. Math for me stood out, though it would often make the smart part of my brain feel bipolar. I'm going to just kind of separate out that dependent clause there. That would make the smart part of my brain feel bipolar. For this comma splice, I am going to go ahead and make that a period. When I understood what the assignment was, comma, I was on top of the world, I would be rivaling the best kids in class. I'm going to put a period there. And then, since we got a but right here, I'm going to turn that into a compound sentence. I would be rivaling the best kids in the class, comma, but a lot of the time, technically should have one there, introductory element. A lot of the time, I would also be in the lowest grade percentile. All right. So let's wrap up, okay? One of the key takeaways from this video, and it's something I repeat all the time to students, is to read your writing aloud, okay? I know it sounds weird. I know it sounds painful. Close the door to your room, do it when no one's home, or go do it in your car, I don't know. and read your writing aloud. You will catch most of your mistakes that way. And some of those style oddities will also probably be made apparent to you. If you're using certain words or certain structures frequently in your paper, so if you're repeating yourself, that'll also be made apparent. So always, always, always read your writing aloud. Secondly, it's proofread. Many students, in my experience, are actually pretty decent writers. Often when I go to my one party a year and I tell people I'm a professor and that I teach writing, I'm often met with, oh, the kids these days, they can't write. Actually, in my experience, again, most students, pretty decent writers. Many of the mistakes they make don't get in the way of understanding the text. They don't affect what we call the intelligibility of the text. But in order to be a good writer, you have to become a good proofreader. So you have to go through your papers, you have to proofread, fix those mistakes. The final thing to keep in mind, and this one's a little bit more cognitive, is that your language habits are idiosyncratic. What I mean by that is by the time you reach college, the language center of your brain is pretty much done and is developed. So any writing habits that you have, you will likely continue to have. So for instance, if you turn in a paper and it's riddled with comma splices, you are likely to consistently have issues with comma splices. But this is where awareness comes in, all right? And this is something I really try to impress upon students, is when I give students feedback, I am not critiquing you as the student, I'm critiquing the writing, and I want you to become a better writer. And how we do that is by becoming more mindful of our writing habits. So if I'm sitting down and working with a student and they have comma splices, I will show them how to identify them, or if they have issues with sentence fragments, I will show them how to identify them. Then, then the next essay, it's on them, right? It's kind of like, okay, I've shown you this issue that you have. Now show me that you've learned, kind of how to address your idiosyncrasies in your writing. And in my experience, as students become more and more aware of their writing habits, their writing improves. Become a student of your own writing. If you do that, that will help you become a better writer. What will also help, it's going to be the refrain you hear me say in all these videos, always, always, always either talk to your professor via email or going to office hours, or and going to tutoring, right? Those are absolutely going to be your best resources. I hope this video was helpful. If you have questions or if you're not sure about anything, please feel free to reach out and let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you all around. Take it easy.